Definition of price elasticity of demand. Price elasticity of demand is measurement of the change in consumption of a product is relation to a change in its price. Understanding price elasticity of demand. Economists have found that the prices of some goods are very inelastic. There is a reduction in price does not increase demand much, and increase in price does not hurt demand either. For example, gasoline has little price elasticity of demand. Drivers will continue to buy as much as they have to, as will airlines, the trucking industry, and nearly every other buyer. Other goods are much more elastic, so price changes for these goods cause substitution changes in their demand or their supply. Next, what is elasticity? Elasticity is the quantity demanded of a product changes greatly in response to changes in its price. It is termed elastic. That is, the demand point for the product is stretched far from its prior point. If the quantity purchased shows a small change after a change in its price, it is termed inelastic. The quantity did stretch much from its prior point.
So I'm gonna talk about perfectly elastic demand and relative inelastic of demand. First of all, perfectly elastic demand. When a small change in price of a product causes a major change in its demand, it is said to be perfectly elastic demand. When perfectly elastic demand, a small rise in price result fall in demand to zero, while a small fall in price cause increase in demand to infinity. In such case, the demand is perfectly elastic, or E equal to infinity. You see the graph from figure 2. It can be interpreted that at price OP, demand is infinite. However, a slight rise in price will result fall in demand to zero. Next, we have relative inelastic of demand. Relative inelastic demand is one when the percentage change produced in demand is less than the percentage change in the price of a product. For example, if the price of product increased by 30% and the demand of the product decreased only 10%, the demand will be called relative inelastic. The nominal value of relative elastic demand range between 0 to 1. Marshall has termed relative inelastic demand as elasticity being less than unity. You see the graph. It can be interpreted from figure 5 that the proportionate change in demand from OQ1 to OQ2 is relatively smaller than the proportionate change in price from OP1 to OP2.
So for the third one is the perfectly elastic demand. In a perfectly elastic demand, a small rise in price result in fall in demand is zero. A small fall in price causes increase in demand to infinity. Such in case, the demand is perfectly elastic. And we can see in the slide that the demand curve is represented as a horizontal straight line. And from the graph, it can be interpreted that at price O to P, the demand is infinite. However, a slight rise in price would result in fall in demand to zero. And at the price P, the consumers are ready to buy as much quantity of the product as they want. But a small rise in price would resist consumers to buy the product. For the next one is relatively elastic demand. For the relatively elastic demand, it refers at the demand when the proportionate change produced in demand is greater than the proportionate change in price of a product. The numerical value of relatively elastic demand range between 1 to infinity. The demand curve that we can see in the slide is for the relatively elastic demand is gradually sloping, and from the graph it can be interpreted that the proportionate change in demand from OQ1 to OQ2 is relatively larger than the proportionate change in price from OP1 to OP2. Relatively elastic demand has practical application as demand for many of products respond in the same manners with respect to change. And for the example for the relatively elastic demand is the air travel for vacational. And for the elastic demand is the unitary elastic demand. For the unitary elastic demand, that is the theory that as price increase by X% and the demand falls by an equal to X%. In the reality, there are no example of unitary demand. The reason being is that human demand is non-linear. There is not a direct relationship between the price and the demand. The change in demand produces the same change in the price of the product, and the demand is referred as a unitary elastic demand. For the numerical value for the unitary elastic demand is equal to 1.
Okay, now I will explain about the determinants of price elasticity of demand. So basically there are 7 determinants of price elasticity of demand. The first one is the availability of substitutes. Okay, if the substitutes for goods are already available, then the demand for the goods will be elastic towards changes in price, because when the price increase, the consumers will replace the goods with the cheaper one. And it is also vice versa, which means if there are no availability of substitutes, then the demand will be inelastic towards changes in price. So we can conclude it as the higher the availability of substitutes goods, the higher the elasticity of demands for the goods. Okay, the second one is the proportion of expenses from income, which means if the expenditure of goods involve a small proportion of income, the demand for the goods will be inelastic towards changes in price. This one is also vice versa, which means if the expenditure of goods involve a larger proportion of income, the demand will be elastic towards changes in price. For example, the demand for the sugar is inelastic because the expenditure for sugar involves small proportion of income. Okay, now move to the third one, which is number of uses. If the goods has multiple uses, then the demand for the goods will be elastic towards changes in price. This one is also vice versa, which means if the goods doesn't have many uses, then the demand for the goods will be inelastic towards changes in price. Okay, the example of the goods that has multiple uses is smartphone, which we can use it to contact others, listen to the music, snap pictures. And the fourth one is importance. Okay, demand for the goods that have high necessary will be inelastic towards changes in price, while demand for normal goods is elastic towards changes in price. Okay, the example of the goods that has high necessary in our daily life is water and electricity supply, rice, sugar, salt, and many more. Okay, for the fifth one, we have time period. in time period, we have two terms, which are short term and long term. For the short term, demand for the goods is inelastic towards changes in price because substitutes are harder to be found at the short notice. So the consumers will keep purchasing the goods even the price is quite expensive. For the long term, the demand for the goods is elastic towards changes in price because consumers have more time to find the substitutes for the goods. Okay, the sixth one is we have consumer habit. Okay, even if the goods is not really necessary, but the demand will be inelastic towards changes in price because of consumer habit of using that kind of goods. For example, smokers will keep purchasing cigarettes even if they know that cigarettes doesn't benefit them anything. Okay, for the last one, we have branding. In branding, the demand for the goods will be inelastic towards changes in price due to the loyalty of consumers toward the same product that they are usually used. So no matter how many product that has been offered out there, but the consumer will still buy the same brand product that they are usually purchase, even the product is quite expensive compared to others.